Someone asks you for something you don't have the energy to give. You say yes anyway. Someone assumes your time is available because it always has been. You don't correct them. Someone crosses a line, not for the first time, and you absorb it, file it somewhere, tell yourself it's fine. And then, alone, you feel that particular mixture of resentment and self-contempt that has no clean name, because you're not sure who to be angry at. Here's what makes this harder to admit than it looks. You're not being walked on because you're weak. You're not being walked on because you're too kind, too patient, too giving. Those are the stories that let you stay comfortable. Alfred Adler, the psychologist who mapped the hidden architecture of power in human relationships more precisely than almost anyone who came before or after him, would tell you something that cuts closer to the bone. You're being walked on because you have been, consistently and over time, teaching people that it's allowed, not with words, with patterns, with what you've absorbed without protest, with every line you said you had, and then didn't hold. Respect, in Adler's framework, is not something people extend to you because you deserve it. It is something you calibrate through behavior, yours and theirs, over the course of a relationship. And if the calibration is off, if the signal you've been sending is that your limits are soft, and your no is negotiable, and your resentment will eventually pass, then the people in your life aren't misbehaving. They're responding accurately to what you've shown them. This video is not about becoming harder. What follows are 7 rules, drawn directly from Adler's psychology of power, respect, and interpersonal dynamics, that change not just what you do, but where you stand when you do it. The first 2 build the internal foundation without which the other 5 collapse under pressure. The last 2 are the ones nobody wants to look at. All 7 are things you can begin today. Not as a project, as a decision. So let's start with the one Adler considered the most fundamental truth of social life, and the one you've most likely been ignoring for years. Most people believe that being walked on is something that happens to them, a character defect in the other person, bad luck in relationships, a pattern they stumbled into without contributing to. Adler would dismantle that belief in the first session. Every relationship you have is a training ground, not metaphorically, literally. Every time you accept something in silence, you are teaching. Every time you absorb a violation without response, you are demonstrating where the real boundary is, which is exactly where you stopped defending yourself the last time. The other person doesn't need to be cruel or calculating for this to happen. They don't even need to be paying attention. They are simply learning through accumulated experience what is and isn't possible with you. In understanding human nature, Adler argues that all social behavior is goal-directed, that people move through relationships not randomly, but according to patterns established early and reinforced continuously. What this means in practice is that the person who consistently asks too much of you isn't doing it because they woke up one day and decided to exploit you. They're doing it because the pattern you've established together has never given them a reason to do otherwise. Your availability trained their expectations. Your silence trained their assumptions. Your eventual explosion, which you probably apologized for afterward, trained them that the cycle resets. This is the rule that makes all the others possible, and it's the one people resist most, because it asks you to stop being the victim of the story you've been telling about your relationships. It asks you to look at the pattern and ask, what have I been teaching? The answer usually arrives quickly. You already know the moments. The favor you agreed to, that you resented immediately. The deadline someone assumed you'd accommodate because you always had. The tone that crossed a line you let pass because confronting it felt like too much. Each of those moments was a lesson. Taken together, they constitute a curriculum, and the people in your life have been excellent students. The practical implication of this rule is not to become reactive or start correcting every minor slight. It is to identify the one or two patterns that keep repeating and trace them back to the first time you let them pass. That moment, the original tolerance, is where the training began, and it is the only place where it can be meaningfully revised. Not through a conversation about the past, not through an explanation of how you feel, through a different response the next time the pattern presents itself. What changes when you hold that response is not just the dynamic with that person. What changes is the signal you're transmitting. And Adler was clear that the signal precedes everything. Before you say a single word, before any negotiation begins, the psychological position you occupy in a relationship is already broadcasting. The question the next rule forces you to answer is whether the signal you've been sending is one you actually chose. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Think about the last time you said no to someone. Really think about it. Chances are, the no didn't arrive alone. It came with an explanation, a softening, a qualifier, an apology buried inside the phrasing. I can't because I would, but I'm sorry, You handed them the refusal and then immediately handed them the tools to dismantle it. This is one of the most revealing patterns in Adler's clinical work. The compulsive need to justify a limit, to wrap every boundary in a narrative the other person can evaluate and potentially override, is not a communication style. It is a confession. It is the behavioral expression of a belief operating just below conscious awareness. That your limits are not self-evidently valid, that they require external ratification to become real, that the other person has some implicit authority to decide whether your no is good enough. Adler identified this as a direct expression of what he called the inferiority complex, not in the colloquial sense of simply feeling insecure, but in the precise clinical sense of a person who has organized their social behavior around the need for approval as a precondition for self-worth. When you over-explain a boundary, you are not being polite. You are submitting the boundary for review. You are saying, in effect, I will hold this position only if you agree it's reasonable. And the people who walk over you have learned with remarkable accuracy that a detailed explanation is an invitation to negotiate. The mechanics of this are worth watching in yourself because they operate fast. Someone makes a request you don't want to fulfill. Before you've finished processing whether you want to say no, your mind is already constructing the justification, assembling the reasons that will make the refusal acceptable to them. That construction is the problem. It means you've already accepted that your experience alone is insufficient grounds for a limit. You need a case. You need evidence. You need them to understand and agree before the boundary is allowed to stand. In Understanding Human Nature, Adler writes about the relationship between courage and social adjustment. How the person who has genuinely developed a stable sense of self-worth moves through social life without the constant need to be ratified by others. That stability is not indifference. It is simply the internalized knowledge that your limits exist because you have them, not because someone else approved them. A limit grounded in that knowledge sounds different. It lands differently. It doesn't invite the same negotiation because it isn't structured as a proposal. The practice here is uncomfortable, but immediate. The next time you need to decline something, a request, an imposition, an assumption about your availability, say no without the architecture. Not coldly, not aggressively, simply directly. That doesn't work for me. I'm not going to be able to do that. No. Full stop. Notice what happens in the 2 or 3 seconds after. The discomfort you feel in that silence is not evidence that you've done something wrong. It is evidence that you've stopped submitting the boundary for review, and that your nervous system hasn't caught up yet to the fact that the review was never required. What follows from this rule is where the behavior becomes concrete. Because once you've stopped justifying the limit, the next question is when you assert it. And Adler's answer to that is more precise and more demanding than most people expect. Resentment has a construction process. It doesn't arrive fully formed. It is built carefully and over time, from violations you decided not to address at the moment they occurred. You told yourself you were being patient, mature, not the kind of person who makes everything into a confrontation. And then one day, something small happens, genuinely small, objectively minor, and you respond with an intensity that confuses everyone in the room, including you. Adler would recognize this pattern immediately. The explosion that seems disproportionate to its trigger is never actually about its trigger. It is the accumulated weight of every first violation you absorbed and filed away, every moment you chose postponement over response. The person across from you didn't cause the explosion. They happened to be present when the storage capacity ran out. Rule 3 is this: act at the first violation, not the 15th. Not because the first violation is necessarily severe, but because addressing it at the moment it occurs is the only thing that interrupts the training before it becomes a pattern. The longer you wait, the more the dynamic consolidates. The more it consolidates, the higher the emotional cost of addressing it, until the cost feels so high that you continue absorbing instead, adding to the inventory, moving the explosion further down the road. The practical form of this rule is not a confrontation. It is a calm, immediate, specific response to the specific thing that just happened. Not, "You always do this." Not an inventory of past grievances. Something precise and present. That doesn't work for me. I need you to not do that. That crossed a line. Said once, without escalation, at the moment the line was crossed. The earliness is the point. What you address at the first occurrence, you do not have to address at the 10th. Rule 4 operates alongside it, and it is the one people find most destabilizing: separating intent from impact. The person who consistently disrespects you while meaning well is still consistently disrespecting you. Their good intentions do not neutralize your experience. They do not constitute a reason to continue tolerating something that is costing you. This is harder than it sounds, because most people who walk over you are not malicious. They are careless. They are habituated. They are operating according to the pattern you established together, often without any awareness that a pattern exists, and their genuine confusion when you finally respond. The hurt look, the "I didn't mean it that way," can feel like evidence that you're being unfair. Adler would say, you've confused the question of their character with the question of your limits. These are separate questions. Someone can be a good person and still be bad for your psychological equilibrium. Someone can mean well and still be causing damage. The relevant variable is not what they intended. It is what keeps happening. In the practice and theory of individual psychology, Adler describes how neurotic patterns are sustained not by the person who initiates them, but by the person who absorbs them. How the recipient's tolerance becomes the mechanism by which the dynamic perpetuates itself. You are not a passive surface on which other people's behavior lands. You are an active participant in every dynamic you remain in without response. Continuing to excuse impact because the intent was good is not generosity. It is a form of collaboration with your own erosion. What these two rules share is an insistence on the present tense. Not the history, not the relationship's overall ledger, not what the person usually means. What just happened, right now, addressed now. That narrowness is not pettiness, it is precision. And precision, Adler would argue, is what distinguishes a limit that holds from a limit that exists only in theory. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Watch what happens when someone you know says no. Not a tentative no, not an apologetic no. A A clean, unadorned no. No explanation trailing behind it, no softening clause, no compensatory offer attached to the refusal. Just no. The discomfort in the room is immediate and specific. It feels, somehow, like aggression, like rudeness, like something has been withheld that was owed. That discomfort is not accidental. It is the product of a social conditioning so thorough that most people have internalized it completely. The belief that a refusal without justification is inherently hostile, that the decent thing to do when declining is to provide enough reasoning to make the other person comfortable with your decision, to manage their disappointment, to ensure they don't leave the interaction feeling rejected. Adler saw this pattern in his clinical work with remarkable consistency. Patients who could not refuse without negotiating, who built into every no an implicit counteroffer, a consolation, a route back in, were not doing this out of kindness. They were doing it out of a fear of finality. A clean no closes a door. A no with attachments leaves it open just enough that the other person can push back through, and the whole cycle of request, resistance, and eventual capitulation can begin again. The negotiation embedded in the refusal isn't generosity. It's a structural guarantee that the refusal won't hold. You've seen this operate in yourself. Someone asks for something you genuinely cannot or do not want to give. You say no, but then immediately offer an alternative. Not now, but maybe later. Not this, but perhaps that. I can't do the whole thing, but I could do part of it. The other person, reasonably from their perspective, treats the alternative as the real answer and begins negotiating from there. By the end of the conversation, you've agreed to something, which is roughly what would have happened if you'd said yes in the first place. The no was never actually a no. It was the opening move of a negotiation you didn't realize you'd entered. The rule is not about becoming inflexible or refusing to ever compromise. It is about understanding that a no which requires supplementation is a no that doesn't believe in itself. And a no that doesn't believe in itself teaches the other person not to believe in it either. In practice, this rule asks you to do something that will feel disproportionately difficult the first several times you try it. End the sentence. I'm not going to be able to do that. Period. Not, but maybe next week. Not, although if you really need someone I could try. The sentence ends. What follows is silence, and the silence belongs to them. You do not fill it. You do not rush to smooth the edges of your own refusal. You let it stand as a complete thing, which it is. What changes when a no is structurally complete is not just the outcome of that specific interaction. What changes is the category you occupy in the other person's understanding of you. A person whose no is consistently negotiable becomes, over time, someone whose no is treated as an opening position. A person whose no is consistently final becomes someone whose no is taken seriously before it's even fully spoken. This is Adler's training principle operating in the other direction. You are still teaching, still calibrating, still transmitting a signal. The question is only what the signal says. The next rule is where this becomes genuinely difficult, because holding a clean no is a technical skill, uncomfortable but learnable. What comes after it requires something deeper, the willingness to stop needing the person you just refused to still think well of you. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from the people who openly disrespect you, but from the ones you keep trying to manage, the ones you set a limit with, and then immediately monitor for signs of displeasure, whose reaction to your no you spend the next several hours replaying, whose opinion of you as a good and reasonable person you are working, underneath everything, to protect. This is the most invisible trap in the entire structure, and it is where most genuine attempts at change collapse. Adler's framework locates the problem precisely. The striving for approval, what he identified as one of the primary compensatory mechanisms for a deep sense of inferiority, does not disappear when you learn the technical skills of refusal. It relocates. You say the no. You hold the boundary. And then you spend enormous psychological energy trying to ensure the other person doesn't think badly of you for having done it. You follow up. You soften retrospectively. You offer unsolicited reassurance that you still care about them, still value the relationship, still see yourself as someone who is fundamentally kind. The limit is technically in place, but you're paying for it with a currency you can't afford to keep spending. The mechanism Adler identified is this: you cannot simultaneously need someone's approval and hold a position they disapprove of. These two states are in direct conflict, and one of them will win. In every case he documented of chronic boundary failure, of people who understood intellectually that they needed to change but couldn't sustain the change past the first moment of resistance. The underlying variable was not courage or assertiveness or communication skill. It was the unresolved need to be seen as good by the specific person doing the violating. This is worth sitting with because it reframes the entire problem. You may have believed until now that the obstacle was knowing what to say or finding the right moment or mustering enough resolve, but Adler would point to something quieter and more structural. The fact that you have been trying to hold limits with people while simultaneously requiring their validation. And you cannot do both. The moment their displeasure becomes intolerable to you, the limit dissolves, not dramatically, but through 100 small accommodations that each seem reasonable in isolation. The practice this rule demands is not indifference to what others think of you. It is a specific, targeted withdrawal of that need from the people who have demonstrated repeatedly that their approval is contingent on your having no limits with them. Because here is what Adler's clinical work reveals about that particular kind of approval. It is not actually approval of you. It is approval of your availability. It is approval of the version of you that says yes, absorbs, accommodates, never pushes back. The moment you become a person with a consistent no, that approval evaporates, and its disappearance tells you exactly what it was worth. Watch for the moment, after you've held a limit, when the familiar urge arrives to repair something that isn't actually broken. The urge to check in, to explain yourself one more time, to ensure the relationship is still intact. That urge is the approval need speaking. It is asking you to trade the boundary for comfort. Recognizing it as a mechanism rather than a genuine relational instinct is the work of this rule. And it is internal work, invisible to anyone else, conducted in the gap between the held limit and the hand that reaches back to undo it. What Adler ultimately argued is that the person who stops needing approval from those who disrespect them hasn't become colder. They've become more honest about what the relationship actually was, and that honesty is what the final rule is built on. The seventh rule is the one that arrives last because it requires everything that came before it to be true first. You cannot reach it by skipping the others. It is not a technique or a practice or a reframe. It is a conclusion, the one Adler's entire framework moves toward, and the one most people spend years avoiding because of what it asks them to accept. Relationships that only function when you have no limits are not relationships. They are arrangements. They are structures built on the implicit agreement that you will remain without edges, that your availability will stay unlimited, that the version of you which asks for nothing and absorbs everything is the version that gets to stay. When you begin to change, when the rules in this video become real behavior rather than intentions, some of those structures will not survive. Not because you destroyed them, because they were never designed to hold a person who took up their actual amount of space. This is the loss Adler's psychology prepared his patients to face. Not the dramatic loss of obviously toxic relationships, which is easy to grieve because the damage is visible. The harder loss is of relationships that seemed good, seemed warm, seemed mutual, until the moment you stopped being endlessly accommodating and discovered that the warmth was contingent on that accommodation. The person didn't become cruel. They simply became distant, inconvenienced, subtly less available. And in that distance you can read clearly what the relationship was actually built on. What Adler found consistently in patients who completed this shift, who moved from operating out of approval need to operating out of genuine self-respect, was not the social devastation they had feared. It was clarification. The relationships that survived the change survived it because they were real. The people who remained because they were responding to you, not to your limitlessness. And those relationships, Adler noted, had a different quality entirely. Not warmer in the sentimental sense, but more honest, more stable, built on something that didn't require you to diminish yourself to maintain. In Understanding Human Nature, Adler writes that social feeling, genuine connection, real community, is possible only between people who meet as equals, not equals in status or achievement, but equals in the basic psychological sense. Two people who each occupy their own ground, who each bring a self that has edges and weight, who are not performing availability, but actually present. You cannot have that kind of connection from the position you've been occupying. You can have warmth, familiarity, even affection, but not the thing Adler considered the deepest purpose of social life, which is genuine mutual recognition between people who are fully there. The internal shift he described is not an event. It is a reorientation from a psychology of need, where your behavior in relationships is organized around what you require from others to feel acceptable, to a psychology of self-respect, where your sense of your own worth precedes the interaction and does not depend on its outcome. That shift is what makes the 7 rules in this video sustainable rather than exhausting. Without it, every held boundary costs enormous energy because you are fighting 2 opponents simultaneously, the person in front of you and the part of yourself that is begging you to take it back. With it, the boundary simply reflects what is already true about where you stand. You won't get there all at once. The approval need is old, and it runs deep, and it will make its case in the voice of kindness, of reasonableness, of not wanting to hurt anyone. But you know the difference now between kindness and capitulation, between generosity and the compulsive erasure of yourself in service of someone else's comfort. That difference is where this begins. And if what you just watched resonated somewhere specific, not generally, but in the part of you that recognized itself in it, the video appearing on your screen right now will take it further. Click to keep watching.